You are alone in a room right now, in some sense. Even if someone else is home, there is a version of you that no one has ever met. Not your closest friend. Not the person who shares your bed. Not even, some nights, you yourself. It waits behind the eyes, watching the version of you that smiles at dinner, that nods in meetings, that says, "I'm fine," with a fluency that would impress a diplomat. You have built an entire self out of the art of being acceptable. This is not a story about isolation as a symptom. It is not about loneliness, the pain of absence, the empty apartment, or the phone that does not ring. That is a different kind of wound, and you already know its shape. This is about something else. The solitude a man chooses, or the solitude that chooses him, and what happens next. Because indeed, something does happen next. Carl Jung, who spent years of his life exploring this, believed that what occurs in that silence is not decline, it is formation, and what takes shape there is not always gentle. Think of the moments you've actually felt most yourself. Not the good moments, necessarily. The true ones. Was anyone watching? Probably not. Probably you were driving somewhere at night, or standing in a kitchen at 2 a.m., or sitting very still in a chair doing nothing that could be photographed or admired. In those moments, something in you exhales. The muscles you didn't know you were clenching for other people finally let go. And in that release, there's a strange, almost embarrassing clarity, as if the version of you that shows up for the world is a translation, and the original language only comes back when no one needs you to speak. Most people flee from that language. They fill the silence before it can say anything. Music, notifications, a call to someone, anything to keep that primal voice from finishing its sentence. Because that primal voice is rarely comforting. It does not flatter. It does not validate the story you have told yourself about who you are. It simply observes. And what it perceives most days is a gap, the one between the man you show the world and the man you carry inside. A gap that has been quietly widening for years. Jung had a name for what happens when a person refuses to look at that gap. It does not vanish. It goes underground. It waits. And it comes back later, dressed as anxiety, as a temper that surprises you, as a hunger for validation that no amount of praise ever satisfies. He called the disowned part of the self the shadow. Everything you edited out of your personality because someone, somewhere, once made it unsafe to keep. Not evil, necessarily, just unapproved. The anger you learned to swallow. The ambition you learned to apologize for. The needs you learned to disguise as fine. Solitude is the only place where self-censorship ceases to function. There is no audience to shield, so there is nothing left to hide from. That is precisely why so many men avoid it as if it were dangerous. Because in a sense, it is. Not dangerous to them, but to that version of themselves constructed for the comfort of others. When left alone and undisturbed for long enough, that manufactured self begins to flicker like a signal losing its connection, and something more solid begins to emerge from beneath. You have felt this, perhaps at the age of 11, maybe during a solitary journey, or during an illness, or in that period following a loss when the phone stopped ringing and the world, for an instant, forgot to make demands of you. And in that interval, something inside you quietly opened an eye. The question is not whether solitude changes a man. It's what, exactly, is doing the changing, and why the thing that emerges from that silence so often frightens the very people who claim to love him most. This is where the situation becomes uncomfortable, for the inevitable next question is whether what emerges in solitude is your own truth. You would like to believe it is the former. Everyone wants to believe that. A certain self-help style optimism has conditioned us to assume that whatever surfaces when the noise subsides must be authentic, and that being authentic equates to being good. But Jung never made such a promise. He spent his life studying men who sought their true selves in solitude and returned with something that was authentic, yes, but not remotely safe. Consider what is truly repressed in the forging of a socially functional man. Not just anger, though that is the most obvious, but also appetite. Also the grief that was never given space. Also a certain kind of will, a raw, untamed desire, stripped from you at roughly the same age you learned that desiring too openly makes others uncomfortable. None of this vanishes when you agree to be reasonable. It is filed away in a version of yourself that rarely surfaces in conversation. And solitude, true solitude, the kind with no end date and no witnesses, is precisely the condition under which what was folded away unfolds once more. That is why men who withdraw from the world for an extended period do not usually return any more placid. They return less edited, less inclined to soften a phrase for your comfort, less available, in the sense of that accessibility that once made them easy to deal with. Something about a prolonged absence of an audience teaches a man that, in reality, he does not need one, and that revelation, once internalized, is not undone simply because the audience returns. You may already notice this on a small scale. Consider how different you are after a week spent entirely alone, compared to a week dedicated to performing for others. Your solitary self speaks fewer unnecessary words and seeks less approval for what is said. A frankness emerges that wasn't there before. It is as if solitude strips your speech of every phrase that existed solely to please. Jung would say that such candor is not a flaw caused by isolation. It is a truth that socialization had been quietly suppressing all along. What you call hardening might actually be the shedding of a kind of chronic, low-level dishonesty, the dishonesty of constantly adapting to others. And here is the unsettling part. The people around you may not have loved your honest self, but rather the edited version, which means that the closer you get to your true self in solitude, the further you might drift from those who only knew the unrefined version of you. This is the quiet cruelty hiding inside the whole process. Solitude doesn't just reveal a man to himself. It reveals to him exactly how much of his previous life was built on a performance other people had grown attached to. The mother who preferred the agreeable son. The partner who fell in love with the accommodating version. Not the one now emerging with opinions and edges and a will of his own. Nobody warns you about this part. That self-discovery, taken far enough, is also a small betrayal of everyone who benefited from your self-erasure. And so a strange asymmetry appears. The more time a man spends inside his own silence, the more capable he becomes. Of clarity, of discernment, of knowing precisely what he wants and does not want, and the less tolerable he becomes to the systems and relationships built around his old compliance. He isn't becoming worse, he's becoming accurate. But accuracy, it turns out, is not always welcome. This raises something Jung circled for most of his career without ever fully resolving. If the self that solitude produces is more honest, but also harder, more withdrawn, less willing to shrink for others, is that self healthier or simply less domesticated? Is what we call growth here actually growth at all? Or is it something closer to a man quietly returning to a version of himself that civilization had spent decades trying to sand down? There's a reason he didn't answer that question with comfort. There's a reason he kept circling back to a single image, a tower he built by hand, alone, stone by stone, far from every person who knew him, and what he said he found waiting for him there. The tower Jung built at Bollingen was not a metaphor to him, though it has since become one to nearly everyone who tells this story. It was stone, real stone, laid by his own hands over decades on the edge of a lake, far enough from Zurich that no patient could reach him by accident. He added to it the way a man adds to himself, a room at a time, across years, each addition arriving only when the previous one had been fully lived in, And what he later admitted was that the building itself seemed to know something about him before he did. He would finish a section and only afterward realize what it meant, as if his hands had understood a truth his mind was still too guarded to face directly. It is worth reflecting on this, as it reverses the order most people take for granted. We tend to think that revelation comes first, followed by change. Jung's own account suggests that the opposite happened to him. First came the structure, the retreat, the effort, the solitude, and the revelation arrived later. This implies that men who wait for clarity before deciding to retreat might be reversing the sequence. In this context, clarity is not the price of admission to solitude, but the reward for having endured it long enough and without wavering. And resistance is the key word, because what he described finding in that silence was not something peaceful. He wrote of encountering figures within his own mind that were perceived not so much as thoughts, but rather as presences. An old man, a young woman, a serpentine intelligence that seemed to argue with him. He did not experience them as clever metaphors devised to explain his feelings. He experienced them as autonomous entities, as if his psyche harbored populations he had never known, each with its own will and each older than his conscious sense of self. Whether this is interpreted literally or as the language of a mind pushed to the limit by isolation, the implication is the same. The deeper a man delves into himself, the less that self resembles a single unified narrator. This is closer to what actually happens to you in extended solitude than the tidy version usually sold. It isn't that you find the real you sitting quietly at the bottom of yourself, whole and waiting, like a key under a doormat. It's that you find several unreconciled versions of you, arguing, each with a legitimate claim, none of them lying exactly, none of them the whole truth either. The disciplined one who wants control, the furious one who wants to stop apologizing, the frightened one, still young, still checking the door to see if anyone's coming, the one who is tired of performing competence and simply wants to be held without earning it first. A man who has never spent real time alone assumes he is one person having a bad week. A man who has spent real time alone knows he is a negotiation between several people who all happen to share a face. This knowledge is not comfortable, but it is, Jung insisted, the only honest foundation available. Not unity. Integration, a very different thing, one that requires you to know the argument before you can broker any piece in it. And here's the part that is almost never spoken aloud. Not every voice in that room deserves to take the helm. Solitude does not hand you a clean, ennobled self to replace the social self, the one marked by compromises. What it offers is access. Access to everything, to the noble and the vile, to the wise elder and to that thing dwelling beneath him that longs to set something ablaze just to feel warmth again. What a man does with that access is the only question that remains. Upon gaining that access, some men mistake the most strident voice for the most authentic one. They return from their silence not integrated, but possessed, by resentment, by that part of themselves which solitude finally unleashed and which now mistakes its own volume for authority. This is the danger Jung actually meant, and it has almost nothing to do with violence or malice in the way the phrase gets used casually. The danger is a man who has stopped performing for others before he has learned to govern what performing was quietly containing. He is not dangerous because solitude corrupted him. He is dangerous because solitude removed the lid before he'd built anything sturdy enough to replace it. Which leaves the real question standing exactly where it was, only sharper now. If solitude gives a man access to every version of himself at once, agreeable and monstrous alike, what, precisely, is supposed to decide which one gets to speak? The answer Jung gave was not a rule, it was a relationship. He did not believe that a man tames the voices in that inner room by silencing the ones he dislikes. That is nothing more than the very repression that gave rise to the shadow in the first place, only now directed at oneself rather than at others. What he proposed instead was something more akin to a marriage. You cannot choose which parts of yourself exist. You can only choose whether to know them well enough to negotiate with them before they act on your behalf without warning. This is the distinction that separates the man solitude sharpens from the man solitude ruins, and from the outside they can look identical for a while. Both withdraw, both grow quieter, blunter, less interested in being liked. Both stop performing the agreeable translation. But one of them is listening to the argument in the room and slowly learning which voice tends to be right about what, and when the frightened one should be comforted rather than obeyed, and when the furious one is pointing at something real underneath its noise. The other has simply let the loudest voice win by default and is calling that surrender authenticity, because it feels, for the first time in years, like relief. You can probably tell which one you'd become if you're honest, by looking at what your solitude actually does to your appetite for other people afterward. The integrated version comes back capable of closeness again, but on terms that are finally accurate. He can be alone, so his presence with you is a choice, not a hunger. The unintegrated version comes back further from everyone, mistaking distance itself for depth, confusing the fact that he no longer needs an audience with the far more dangerous idea that he no longer needs to answer to anyone. One kind of solitude produces a man harder to fool. The other produces a man harder to reach. Jung watched this fork happen in his patients constantly, and it's part of why he became so wary of solitude as a fashionable prescription, the thing men are told to go do in cabins to find themselves. Alone is not automatically honest. Alone is just quiet. What fills that quiet, whether it's genuine self-encounter or simply an unsupervised grievance finally given, the microphone, depends entirely on whether a man arrives at his solitude already able to tell the difference between his depth and his damage. Most don't on the first attempt. This is why he insisted the work take years, not weekends. A weekend alone mostly just tires out the performing self enough to let the loudest understudy through. Years alone, if a man survives them without becoming a disciple of his own worst voice, eventually produce something durable enough to be trusted. This is where the essay must retrace its steps, for everything said so far has taken for granted, without question, that solitude is something a man enters and subsequently leaves. But let us consider what that premise actually implies. It continues to measure the entire process by its utility to others. Did that retreat make him a better son, a better partner, or someone easier to live with at dinner time? Jung's own life suggests he viewed it quite differently. He kept adding rooms to that tower for the rest of his life. He never fully reintegrated into the version of the world that wanted him unchanged. The tower was not a retreat from which one recovers. It simply became the place where he truly lived, visiting the ordinary world rather than the other way around. This implies that the question you have been asking yourself all this time, what solitude gives back to a man once it ends, might be based on a flawed premise. Perhaps for some men, it never ends. Not because they have abandoned others, but because they have finally stopped confusing the self they present to the world with their essential self. And if that's true, then the real danger Jung was pointing toward all along was never the man who disappears into himself and comes back changed. It's the man who never leaves at all, who mistakes the sound of his own unchallenged voice, echoing endlessly with no one left to correct it, for the sound of wisdom. A man so far from any mirror but his own that he has forgotten a room full of arguing voices was always supposed to be governed, not simply obeyed. That governing, though, is not a discipline you perform once and then carry forward automatically, the way you might learn to ride a bicycle and never unlearn it. It has to be renewed, conversation by conversation, every time the room fills up again. This is the part almost no one tells you about the men who seem most settled in themselves, the ones who radiate that particular quiet authority, unbothered by whether you approve of them. It isn't that they won the argument inside themselves once and filed it away as finished. It's that they never stopped holding the meeting. You've met men who skipped this part. You may have been one for a season. They found solitude, heard the loudest voice, mistook its confidence for its accuracy, and stopped listening after that. You can spot them by a certain flatness behind the eyes when they talk about themselves. Not depth, but a door that closed a little. Too early. They speak with the certainty of a man who has stopped negotiating with himself, and certainty without the negotiation behind it curdles into something that only resembles strength. It commands a room. It rarely nourishes one. Compare this with the other type. Harder to describe because he doesn't advertise himself. He bears the same rough edges born of solitude, the same refusal to shrink, the same immunity to needing your approval. Yet there is something underlying that keeps him on guard. It is something akin to respect for the ease with which a man can be mistaken about himself when he feels entirely secure. Even so, he returns to his room. He still lets the frightened voice speak at times, even now, even after years, because he learned early on that the moment you stop listening to the quiet ones, the loud one proclaims himself king. This is, in the end, the actual answer to why solitude creates the men it creates. Not because isolation itself sharpens or corrupts, but because it removes every excuse a man has for not knowing which voice inside him is currently driving. Society is, among other things, an elaborate machine for letting you avoid that question forever. It hands you roles, scripts, other people's expectations to react against, an endless supply of external noise to blame for whatever you become. Solitude takes all of that away and leaves you with only the argument itself, unmediated, waiting for a verdict only you can render. Some men, faced with that silence, finally learn to chair the meeting. Others simply let the most wounded, most furious, most starving part of themselves seize the gavel and call it clarity. Both will look to the outside world like men who have changed. Only one of them will have actually grown, which means the tower was never really about the stone, or the lake, or the distance from Zurich. It was about a man finally sitting still long enough to hear every voice he'd spent a lifetime not listening to, and discovering, too late to unknow it, that becoming yourself was never the peaceful arrival everyone had promised. It was an argument you agree to keep having, alone, for as long as you're willing to keep the room honest. Something in the argument itself has been avoiding one voice this whole time, the one that doesn't want governing at all and doesn't want to be heard either. It has been sitting in the corner of every room described so far, unmentioned, while the frightened one spoke, and the furious one spoke, and the disciplined one spoke, and even the old wise one who confirms what the body already knew. This voice says nothing, because it isn't waiting for permission to speak. It's the one that built the room in the first place, and it will still be there long after the argument ends. You could call it the witness. Not a participant in the negotiation, but the thing capable of noticing that a negotiation is happening at all. The part of you present even when every other part goes silent. The part that was watching you read every paragraph of this. It has no opinion about your ambition, or your fear, or your anger. It does not vote. It has never once needed to win. And this is precisely why it so rarely gets mentioned in the story men tell about becoming themselves, because it offers no drama, no confrontation, no scene worth building a whole philosophy around. It only watches, patiently, the way the surface of that lake at Bollingen watched a man lay stone after stone for 30 years without once asking him to hurry. Jung came, late in his life, to suspect that this witnessing presence was the actual center, not the voices, not the shadow, not even the integration of the two. Something underneath the argument, older than any single participant in it, that had never actually been at risk. The frightened one could lose. The furious one could be silenced. But whatever was capable of watching all of it happen, calmly, without needing an outcome, seemed to belong to a different order of thing entirely. He didn't insist on this. He circled it the way he circled everything difficult, cautiously, aware that naming it too precisely would only turn it into one more voice competing for the gavel. But he kept returning to it anyway, the way a man returns to a window he cannot stop looking through. This changes what the tower was for. One last time, it was never really shelter from the world, and it was never really a place to let the shadow finally speak. It was a place quiet enough that a man could notice, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that noticing was happening at all, that behind every version of himself arguing to be heard, something had been sitting still the entire time, asking nothing, needing no verdict, in no danger of ever being cast out. Everything this essay has called depth, damage, integration, governance, all of it took place in front of something that didn't blink. And so, the man who comes back from real, solitude changed is not, in the end, simply a man who let the right voice win the argument. He is a man who found, underneath the argument, someone who was never arguing, and who recognized for the first time that this quiet presence was the one who had been living his life all along, wearing every mask, surviving every performance, waiting without complaint for the noise to finally settle enough to be noticed. In a sense, right now you are alone in a room, even if there is someone else in the house. And so is that which has been watching you while you listen to this. It asks nothing of you. It never has. It simply waits, just as water waits, for you to finally stop confusing the sound of your own voices with the totality of who you are.